Hi guys, this is Beekeeper Charlotte from CarolinaHoneybees.com. I've had a lot of questions from beekeepers, especially new beekeepers, about the cold weather that we're experiencing. So I wanted to pop in for just a minute and talk just a little bit about that. Honeybee colonies have a great system for making it through the winter cold. When it's warm out during summer months and into fall, they will gather nectar, convert it into honey, and store it in their hives. That's how they're able to survive over the winter when there's nothing outside to collect. And the way the honeybee cluster maintains life in the colony is that they will store honey inside the hive, and then the bees will cluster together, usually in the bottom. These straight lines are representing frames. And of course, this is not to scale. It's just to give you an idea. So in the bottom of the hive, this would be my deep, this would be my hive body. I have frames that are full of honey on the outside edges. And here in the middle, we will have the bee cluster. When it's cold, the bees contract close together and they consume honey and vibrate their wing muscles to generate heat. They take turns with bees toward the warmer middle of the circle. They will work their way outside when the bees at the edge begin to become chilled and take their place. And so this constant rotation of warmer bees in the middle taking the place of the colder bees and pushing them down. This is how the colony can maintain their life inside the hive. Well, what happens is they will consume this honey that is near the cluster and on the top of the cluster. And what will happen over time as winter goes on and we go on into spring, most colonies will begin to move up into this full box of honey on top of them. Could be a food super, whether it's another deep or shallow or medium. It doesn't really matter where you live or what type of size boxes you're using. The colony still works in the same way. As the honey is consumed down here, the bees, the cluster, will work its way up into this top box so that it stays in contact with honey. Well, what happens sometimes is when we have a period of extended cold, here in South Carolina, I'm saying when it stays below freezing for days on end. Occasionally, you will have a cluster of bees that will consume all the honey that is within reach of the outer limits of that cluster. And if they cannot reach any honey, so here's your cluster. If they cannot reach any honey, they may not make the transition to this top box and keep themselves in contact with food. And when this happens, this is when we have a colony of bees that will die, that technically starve to death because they have no honey within reach, even though they may have 60 pounds of honey up here. And that tends to happen here more with marginal colonies. I have at least one colony that's not as strong as I wish it was. So I become a little worried about that when we have these extended cold days. Now, if you have cold weather that is interspersed with some warm days as well, what will happen is either the cluster will move up to stay in contact with honey, or some of the worker bees will take honey from other locations and they will bring it and pack it around the perimeter of their cluster. So if we have some warm days, they can move honey if they need to. And bees tend to work up. I don't know why. We don't know why this happens. They just tend to like to work up in the winter in my hives. I don't see them going from side to side very much. So I want to have honey right over the bee's head. When I go in to look at my hives on a warm day in a few weeks, if this cluster has moved up here and I'm not seeing much honey right above them, that is when the sugar cakes and the candy boards can really come into play. If I didn't feed them well enough in the winter, or for some reason they have empty, well, they may have a, so like I said, they have honey frames here, but let's say if they consumed all this honey, I will take the full frame and put it over the cluster and put the empty on the outside, and I will watch that colony very carefully. And when you see this, you can understand that it's important. If you have queen excluders, you know, some people use them and some people don't, and either one's fine. If you have a queen excluder, it should not be on your winter hive. Now, if it's really cold out there, I don't know that I would say take the hive apart and take it out. But when we have our cluster down here and this cluster moves up to the food, if you have a queen excluder here and your queen can't get through, well, what's going to happen to her? She's going to be stuck right here and she's going to freeze to death. Now, sometimes, even when the weather's nice enough, the cluster doesn't move. And we don't really know why that is. It has something to do with size of the cluster. It also has to do with whether or not the bees have brood. Brood are baby bees. And if the colony is starting to raise some brood down here, they don't like to leave brood. So occasionally we'll have a problem where a colony is kind of struggling to make the jump from this lower box to the upper box, but they've got some brood here they don't want to leave. So that gives you an idea of what goes on in the bee colony when we have these cold days. Well, what can you do? Unfortunately, sometimes you can't do a lot, but the best thing you can do is to make sure as you go into winter that your bees are healthy, that you've done mite counts so that you know that they don't have a lot of pests. We want our colonies to be as strong and healthy as possible before cold weather arrives. And then we want to make sure they have plenty of food and keep an eye on what's happening up here. If you live in a region that has some warm days for inspection, you can take off the top and take off the inner cover. You don't have to remove frames. And look and see what's going on right here. You may even lift a frame up a little bit. Do you still see honey in the top? I can look down between my top bars and look and see sometimes if I still have honey here. If I still have, you know, a few inches of honey here, I'm not so much worried about my bees' food. I just make a note of it and keep an eye on it. But if I pop the top on a warm day and I see just bees right here and no honey, and it's not April, that's a concern. In this case, I might want to put sugar cakes or fondant or some type of emergency feeding method in there. So that's just an overview of how your bees survive over the winter, and some of the things that happen. Some we have no control over, and other things that we can do to try to give our bees the very best chance of making it to spring. Appreciate you guys checking in. I hope that answered some questions. Hi to Christy, Gordy, and Julia. Thank you for joining us. David sees mice. Is that a good thing? Mice is not a good thing. In some areas, and you know, I've never had it happen to me, even though I guess it certainly could in a southern area. Some people will have mice get in their hive in the winter. And you will be surprised at the small hole that a mouse can get into, and they will come in the bottom of your colony and come up in here and make a nest. And by the time they do this, it's usually cool weather, and the bees, you would think the bees would chase them out, but no, they won't necessarily. So if you live in an area where this could be a problem, it's a good idea to have a mouse guard on here, and that would help keep them out. Beekeeping is not an exact science. I'm not perfect. I make mistakes every year, and every honest beekeeper is going to admit that. But the more mistakes we make, what we want to do is we want to avoid the continuation of making mistakes. Don't keep making the same mistakes over and over again. And if you stick to that, in time, you do become a better beekeeper. Thank you guys for joining me. I hope you'll visit my website and check out my blog post. They cover most of the topics that beekeepers need to know. And we appreciate you being a part of Carolina Honeybees. So come visit me at carolinahoneybees.com. Thank you.